CISA Knowledge Statement 1.7. Knowledge of the evidence collection techniques, observation, inquiry, inspection, interview, data analysis, forensic investigation techniques, computer-assisted audit techniques used to gather, protect, and preserve audit evidence. Now what this means is, first and foremost, your audit must be supported by objective evidence. It cannot be a matter of opinion. So the next question becomes, how do you collect and preserve such evidence? For your CISA exam, you need to know the various techniques used to gather and preserve evidence. There are several ways to gather information. Inquiry is one of them, literally conducting surveys of key personnel in an organization to discover if particular control objectives are being met. This is particularly effective when part of your audit is checking on compliance with certain policies and industry regulations. Observation. This involves observing people and systems to see if control objectives are being met. Interviews can also be used where you interview key personnel and ask them specific questions. Now, in both the interview and the inquiry options, you need to ensure that you've carefully selected the questions to get optimal information. Don't just do ad hoc questioning. And of course, we have analysis using computer-assisted auditing techniques. We've listed a few here. It's not critical that you know these specific computer-assisted auditing packages. However, you should be aware that computer-assisted auditing techniques are very common, particularly when you have to sample large amounts of data. Normally, you'll store and retain audit evidence in some sort of electronic media, USB drives, hard drives, that sort of thing, and there should be retention policies established ahead of time that show the requirements for storing such evidence, how long it has to be stored, that sort of thing. The main areas covered under this knowledge statement are particularly computer-assisted audit techniques, but also evidence. Now, evidence we've discussed in other lessons, and we're going to continue to discuss it because it's a key part of auditing. Interviewing and observing personnel in the performance of their duties. Continuous auditing. Now, remember, continuous auditing are processes that ensure that audit goals are still being met, even between audits. And of course, audit documentation. Remember, evidence is the information that you're going to base your conclusions on. The Information Systems Auditor gathers conclusive objective data in the course of performing an IS audit. The idea of evidence is to have objective data to support your audit findings. Now, evidence has to directly relate to the objectives of the audit. Tangential information or inconsequential information is not pertinent to an audit. We need evidence or data that directly relates to control objectives. Now, how you gather that evidence is a key issue. Remember the various standards we looked at in an earlier lesson. S6, Performance of Audit Work, talks about evidence and evidence gathering. In addition to gathering it, you have to appropriately organize it and document it in order to support findings and conclusions. How reliable is the evidence, though? Just like with a criminal case that you might have seen on some sort of television drama or movie, different types of evidence have different levels of reliability. What are the factors that determine if a particular piece of evidence is reliable? First of all, whoever provided the evidence, be that a person or a system, are they independent? Do they have no particular stake in the outcome? Independent evidence is what you always want. The qualification of the person providing the information or evidence. Is that person qualified to make the observations and conclusions they're providing you? Objectivity. Is the evidence clearly objective? It's not biased in any particular way, either for or against the audit target. And of course, the timing of the evidence. Now, there are different characteristics that we're concerned with evidence. The confidence level of evidence is based on its value. You also look at audit evidence and consider the following. Is it complete, adequate, and convincing in and of itself. In other words, would this particular piece of evidence or group of evidence pieces lead another information systems auditor to form the same conclusions you have? If so, then that evidence is sufficient. Now, if it wouldn't, if other data is required to come to the same conclusion, then this evidence in and of itself is insufficient. Is it useful? Does it assist any auditor in meeting the audit objectives? You can come up with a great deal of information during an audit. You'll learn a great deal about their information systems, their business processes and practices. All kinds of data will come into your hands. However, not all of it assists you in meeting your audit objectives. It may be evidence, but it's not pertinent to the audit. It has to be reliable. It has to be valid, factual, objective, and supportable. If it's not reliable, none of the rest really matters. You can deal with evidence that in and of itself is not quite sufficient. And evidence that may not be useful may not help your audit but doesn't hurt it. But evidence that's not reliable is a deep, deep concern. Is the evidence relevant? That's very similar to useful. Does it pertain to the audit objectives? Is there a logical relationship to the findings and conclusions that you're basing on this piece of evidence? In other words, if your conclusion is based on a specific piece of evidence, that piece of evidence needs to have a specific and clear logical relationship to your conclusion. There are lots of ways to gather evidence. We start with reviewing the organizational structure as it relates to information systems. This will give you a clue as to who to interview, who to inquire with, who to observe. You'll want to review IS documentation. If the information systems documentation doesn't adequately describe or meet control objectives, then it's very unlikely that the practices of the information systems department will meet those objectives. Review the information system standards. Are they based on well-known, well-established third-party standards? Or are they internal standards? If they're internal standards, do they meet the control objectives? Reviewing policies and procedures. How does this organization handle a security breach? How does it handle data, disposal of old media? What are their policies and procedures for each of these issues? Frankly, it's impossible to do an adequate audit if you don't know what the company's policies and procedures are. Now, and this is based on the previous review of the organizational structure, you can interview appropriate personnel. You want to make sure those personnel are in a position to give you reliable and sufficient evidence. You may wish to also observe processes and employees actually performing their duties. This can really let you know whether or not the policies and procedures are actually being implemented on a regular basis. You can always reperform a particular task to see if it meets or fails to meet control objectives. And of course, a generalized walkthrough can be helpful. Any of these methods, or in fact all of them, you can use on any given audit to try to gather as much evidence as possible. My personal feeling is you should always err on the side of gathering too much evidence and then leave out extraneous or irrelevant data from your final report. But it's better to have data that you have to pare down than to discover you didn't gather enough data. Audit documentation. It's really difficult to over-document an audit. Now, I'm talking about the documentation that you personally gather, not necessarily what goes in your final report. Your audit documentation should, at a minimum, include a complete record of the following things: the planning and preparation of audit scope and objectives. How did you select the scope? How did you choose the objectives? How did you plan your audit? If you're doing walkthroughs, let's have a description of those walkthroughs, or let's actually do a walkthrough of any particular audit area. Do we have an audit program? Exact plan for how we're going to do our audit, what tests we'll conduct, what tools we'll use. And then we also absolutely must document the steps that were actually performed and the evidence gathered. You may use the services of other auditors or experts. One example might be, let's assume that as part of your audit, you have to gather information regarding the security policies as implemented on workstations. However, some of the workstations are Macintosh computers and you don't have adequate Macintosh experience. You might use the services of a Macintosh professional to do that portion of your audit or to at least advise and assist you. Of course, you'll need to fully document whatever you found, your conclusions and your recommendations. It really cannot be overstated that recommendations are a critical part of an audit. It's inadequate to simply tell a customer what gaps they have in their security coverage. You need to give them recommendations to remediate those. And of course, audit documentation in relation with document identification and dates. What documents did you get? What were the dates on those documents? How were they used? All of these items should be part of your audit documentation. That concludes Knowledge Statement 1.7. CISA Knowledge Statement 1.8. Knowledge of different sampling methodologies and other substantive data analytical procedures. In this knowledge statement, we're going to look at two things. First, comparing compliance to substantive testing, and then looking at sampling methodologies. Compliance testing involves gathering evidence in order to test the enterprise's compliance with control procedures. Now, what we're talking about here is any sort of requirement, be it legal, regulatory, industry norm, or internal requirements. We essentially look at various security controls to determine whether they do or do not comply with a specific requirement. This generally involves looking at the overall performance of the control, not specific transactions. Substantive testing is evidence gathered to evaluate the integrity of individual transactions, data, or other information. Put another way, with substantive testing, you're going to be looking at specific transactions or specific data records. Obviously, this gives you a better basis to draw conclusions, but just as obviously, it's much more resource intensive. Throughout this lesson, we'll consider a hypothetical e-commerce company we'll call Acme E-commerce that had 100,000 records, 100,000 transactions during the audit period, which was last calendar year. Now, the presence of internal controls can minimize the number of substantive tests that have to be done. How do we know there are adequate internal controls? Well, that's established via compliance testing. If the controls pass compliance testing, then there is less need for substantive testing. Conversely, any weakness or inadequacy in internal controls will increase the need or number of substantive tests. We still don't want to check every single transaction, and that's where we use something from statistics called sampling. Sampling is done when it's not logical or practical or even possible to test all the transactions. This is usually due to the time and cost needed. Again, we have 100,000 transactions in our hypothetical scenario. Obviously, it is too cost prohibitive to look at all of them. Again, we have 100,000 transactions in our hypothetical scenario. Obviously, it is too cost prohibitive to look at all of them. So once again, we'll be looking at compliance versus substantive testing, and we'll be looking at sampling. So what is a sample? First, let's look at what a population is. A population consists of the entire group of items that we need to examine and draw conclusions on. In our scenario, it's 100,000 records that took place last year. A sample is a subset of that population that we use to infer characteristics about the population. Those inferences are based on examining the characteristics of the sample and extrapolating those results to the population. Now, because of this, the sample has to represent as closely as possible the characteristics of the whole population. Let me explain that with another hypothetical scenario. Let's assume that you've been tasked with determining the average height for males in France. You're not going to measure every single male in France. That's simply not practical, not even possible. So you're going to get a sample of males in France. But you chose your sample from a convention for horse jockeys, men who ride horses in horse races. Now, horse jockeys tend to be abnormally small men, much smaller than average. So all of the conclusions you draw don't really apply to the population. Because you used poor sampling methodology, all of the inferences you draw are going to be inaccurate. That same thing applies to every audit you do. When you're sampling records, if you make the wrong selection in your sample, then your conclusions will be wrong. In some cases, even the exact opposite of what the reality is for the general population. So you can see that sampling methodology is very important. Sampling can be either statistical or non-statistical. Let's look at statistical first. Statistical sampling uses objective methods to determine first the sample size. Let's pause and comment on that. We have 100,000 transactions to consider. Without any reference to statistical methodologies, I think you already intuitively know that selecting 5 records for your sample is not enough. And I think just as much you're aware that you don't need to select 50,000 records. So we use objective methods to select sample size. Our selection criteria is based on objective methods. The most obvious is to randomly select, but are we sure we randomly selected? Are we sure we selected in such a way as to not skew our results? And that gives us the precision of our sample. All of these things are going to impact the reliability or confidence level we have in our sample. Now, for just a moment, let's reflect on confidence levels and statistics. The term confidence level has a very specific meaning within the world of statistics. For the purpose of the CISA exam, you don't have to know statistics. There will be no questions wherein you have to perform statistical calculations. And I know that's quite a relief to some of you. However, let me state that in my opinion, the better knowledge you have of statistics and the more you apply statistics, the better auditor you will be. But for our purposes, prepping you for the CISA, you don't need to know statistics. And I say that because the word confidence level has a very specific meaning in the world of statistics. Now, statistical sampling can be used to infer population characteristics from the sample, and so it's the preferred method. Well, you might be wondering, if it's the preferred method, why do we have an alternative method? Why not just always use statistical? Well, let's look at that alternative method, and I think that will answer that question. Non-statistical sampling does not use any objective methods. It's purely subjective judgment to determine the method of sampling, sample size, and sample selection. Non-statistical sampling cannot be used to infer population characteristics, and it's not the preferred method. So when might you use it? Well, let's look at that first statement. It cannot be used to infer population characteristics. So non-statistical sampling can be used when you don't wish to infer population characteristics. Let's assume that of our 100,000 transactions, the overwhelming majority are all roughly $100 in amount or less. I would like to look at the small handful of transactions that exceeded $1,000. Well, I already know that these are not representative of the population. I already know that any conclusions about this very small sample cannot be extrapolated to the population. I don't intend to infer population characteristics from the sample. In that scenario, it's possible to use non-statistical sampling. Sampling methods are of 2 types, attribute sampling and variable sampling. Let's look at attribute first. Sometimes this is called proportional sampling. We will select some specific attribute and look for either the presence of that attribute or the absence. For example, I might look at those transactions that had sales tax or did not have sales tax. This is often used in compliance testing. Our sales tax scenario is a great example. If you did not apply sales tax, did you comply with regulatory requirements for scenarios where sales tax is not required? The conclusions are often expressed in rates of incidence, how many transactions per 100, per 1,000, or per million actually meet or fail to meet that presence or absence of the attribute. Lots of ways to do this. You can simply sample all the transactions, grabbing those that have the attribute, or you can pick a fixed sample size, or you can pick a frequency. Another way to do this is stop or go sampling. Let's assume you've determined that the appropriate sample size is 1,000 transactions. You first examine the very first 1,000 transactions in the database. If they have the attribute you're looking for, you stop, and that just became the sample you'll work with. If not, you go to the next 1,000 and look again to see if that attribute exists. You'll continue this until you find a group of 1,000 that has your attribute, and that's your sample. Discovery sampling is even less common. Essentially, you have an item that is so uncommon, so rare, that you're basically waiting until it's discovered. Now, in addition to attribute sampling, we have variable sampling. Variable sampling is often used to estimate some quantitative measure like dollar value or weight. Dollar value is far more common, so this is often called dollar estimation. Usually we're going to calculate a statistical mean for whatever measurement we're looking at, for example, dollar, so it's also often called mean estimation sampling or quantitative sampling. This is often applied in substantive testing, and it provides conclusions related to any deviations from that norm. There's basically two main ways to do this: unstratified or stratified. Stratified simply means we've already divided up the population into ranges, such as all transactions ranging from $10 to $100, all transactions ranging from $101 to $200, all ranging from $201 to $300, so on and so forth. So we have stratified or unstratified. Computer-assisted audit techniques are often used for gathering and analyzing data from computer systems to meet some audit objective. Now, you can probably realize that with sampling of large number of transactions used in substantive testing, a computer-assisted audit technique is almost a requirement. It's almost impossible to do this effectively by hand. Computer-assisted audit techniques involve a few things in the process. First, you have to understand the client's needs and their goals. That's going to help you select the appropriate computer-assisted audit technique. Now you have to ensure that that technique will obtain effective evidence. You have to ensure that it provides data analysis. I mentioned previously that you're not going to be asked to do any sort of statistical calculation, but your computer-assisted audit technique should be able to, and it should be able to report on findings. Now, these techniques are going to vary, and they're based on differences in hardware, software, data structures, record formats, the general IT environment, and the processing functions. There are lots of examples of computer-assisted audit techniques. First of all, we have generalized audit software like IDEA and ACL. Then we have utility software. Your transactions are undoubtedly stored in a database. Most database management systems have a variety of report writers and even the ability to extract specific elements of data. As a side note, the CISA exam does not require you to know structured query language or SQL. However, in your actual audit practice, if you're going to rely on database management systems, particularly relational database management systems, a basic knowledge of SQL, structured query language, will allow you to extract data with all kinds of formats, with all kinds of criteria, and even to perform some basic statistical calculations, such as calculating the mean. Debugging and scanning software is often used in auditing the IT systems themselves. In many cases, test data is important. You want to be able to test to ensure that your computer-assisted audit technique is functioning properly. Expert systems rely on elements of artificial intelligence, and essentially the issue with expert systems is that they're able to answer more questions than you asked. With normal techniques, like SQL commands that we've already mentioned, you have to ask a specific question. I want all transactions in this date range with this dollar amount. Expert systems can look at the complete body of data and often are able to pull out specific relationships you didn't know to ask for. They are less common and far more expensive. Third-party access control software can be used to audit the access control process. Any application software tracing and mapping will allow you to map out exactly what particular software is doing and therefore audit it. Many systems have all kinds of options built in them, including reporting. All of these techniques can be used to assist in your audit. The functional capabilities of all the generalized audit software should be as follows. File access. Your data is going to come to you in a variety of file structures and record formats. You need to ensure that your audit software is capable of accessing all of the record formats and structures that you need to access. It should also provide you with reorganization so you can sort, merge, link, and index the data as you see fit. It should give you a wide variety of data selection options, filtering data, selecting data, that sort of thing. It should have built into it a number of statistical functions, including sampling, stratification, frequency analysis, and computing basic statistics such as statistical mean, mode, standard deviation, variance, that sort of thing. There should also be arithmetic functions and operators within the software. This concludes Knowledge Statement 1.8. CISA Knowledge Statement 1.9. Knowledge of reporting and communication techniques, including facilitation, negotiation, conflict resolution, audit report structure, issue writing, the management summary, and result verification. Communication needs to be effective and clear in order to improve the quality of the audit and maximize results. The final product that you produce from any audit is essentially communication. There will be a written report along with an executive summary and usually a verbal briefing at the end of the audit. No matter how effective and how high a quality your audit was, if your communication of the results and findings is inefficient, then the audit itself will be less effective. Put another way, your report's going to have to give clear and concise as well as detailed information regarding your conclusions, your recommendations, and the basis for those conclusions and recommendations. It's also the case that your verbal communication can either improve or be a negative impact, have a deleterious effect on the audit outcome. When an argument ensues between the auditor and the auditee during the final findings report presentation, it's usually over the accuracy of the findings in the report. This makes the audit process counterintuitive, perhaps even counterproductive, and quickly dilutes the audit process and its value. Now you may be wondering, an argument ensuing? When might this occur? You have to consider the perspective of the auditee. Many auditees will consider any deficiencies documented in your report as essentially an attack on the quality of their work, because your report is essentially stating that current existing IS controls fail to meet requisite standards. They're substandard. They're not effective. And that is often taken as a criticism of at least certain members of the auditee staff. A natural and common reaction is to reject your findings, to question the accuracy of your findings, and that's where disputes will occur. Now we will look at some techniques both in your written report and your verbal communication that can ameliorate this situation. Audit findings will often be ultimately reported to stakeholders. Before that occurs, they need to have appropriate buy-in from the auditees. This is the only way to have a successful audit process and add value to the auditee organization. In other words, it's a good idea to get the appropriate auditee IT staff members involved before you present to stakeholders. In other words, if you can get the IT staff to agree with your conclusions and your recommendations before presenting to stakeholders, it's much more likely that these implementations will be agreed upon and will be effected. Throughout your entire audit, good communication and negotiation skills are required, and it's not possible to overemphasize this point. You might be the most excellent information system auditor on the planet, and you might conduct a perfect audit from a technical point of view. But if you have poor communication skills that alienate the auditee or at least members of the auditee staff, you will decrease the efficacy of your audit. Communication skills determine the effectiveness of the audit reporting process. So our main areas of coverage are how to communicate audit results, along with the Information Technology Assurance Framework Section 2600 reporting standards. In addition to the material in this lesson, it's probably a good idea to refer to that specific standard prior to taking the CISA exam. During the exit interview, that's your final briefing with the auditee. The IS auditor has to ensure several things. First and foremost, make absolutely certain that the facts you present in your report are accurate. You must be aware that anyone can make a mistake, including you or me. So first, double-check your results, particularly any results that point to any flaws in the auditee systems, particularly egregious and significant flaws. You need to double-check your accuracy. Now, part of your report will be to recommend remediation steps. Make sure your steps that you've recommended are both realistic and cost-effective. It's not helpful if your recommendations are too expensive, maybe too vague, or simply unrealistic. Then recommend specific implementation dates for those recommendations that they have agreed upon. In other words, once you get the auditee to agree on a specific step to remediate an issue, recommend a specific date to implement it. And again, make sure that date is both realistic and cost-effective. There's lots of things you can do in your presentation. You should always include an executive summary. Now, an executive summary is essentially an easy-to-read, concise summary of your report. It lacks some of the detail and supporting evidence, but gives the overall picture. You may choose to use visual presentation aids such as slides or computer graphics. I often like to include charts wherever possible. Before you communicate any results of an audit to senior management, it's a good idea to discuss the findings with the lower level management staff and perhaps even the IT staff of the audited entity. That way you can work out any discrepancies or issues prior to informing senior staff. The purpose of this is to ensure that all relevant parties agree on both what you found and the corrective actions you recommended. Now, it's a good idea if you become familiar with the ISACA S7 reporting and S8 follow-up activities prior to taking the CISA exam. Both those are important to know. Let's talk about communication skills. We've already indicated that poor communication skills can have a negative impact on the entire auditing process, particularly on the reporting and recommendation phase. Let's start with facilitation. There are a lot of techniques you can use to facilitate clear communication. The first, at least in my opinion, is to put yourself in the other person's perspective. If you are, for example, going to list an issue with network security that impacts the gateway router, how would you react to this news if you were the network administrator responsible for that router? And how can you phrase the issue so as not to be accusatory and not to engage in conflict? That's one step to facilitating good communication. Another one is good listening skills. Now, a lot of people overlook listening skills. Clearly, you're capable of hearing what the other person said, but that's not the same thing as listening. You need to fully understand the factual information they're communicating to you and their emotional tone. The idea of communication is to take information from party A and get it to party B. Anything that degrades the communication received is adversarial to communication. Let me put that another way. When you're listening, be engaged, be focused. Don't simply be waiting to talk. Listen carefully to what the person is saying, but also listen to their tone of voice, their posture, facial expressions, and try to imagine how you would feel if you were in their position. Another thing you can use is called active listening. Where appropriate, either ask a clarifying question, brief, or restate it in your own terms and see if you're hearing what they meant you to hear. Make absolutely sure you fully understand by facilitating your communication. It's also important to not use any language that's accusatory. Let's not come across as if we're blaming the auditee's IT staff. Now, in most cases, you're not. In most cases, they're simply human beings. They executed very good procedures, but something was missed. That's okay. That's why we have audits. In a few rare cases, the IT staff has egregiously mismanaged security, and it is perhaps really their fault. But you still don't want to come off saying that. You want them to support your audit goals and recommendations and to be on board. This also can involve negotiation and conflict resolution. Negotiation, you have to be willing to give up something in return for something. For example, you may be recommending a remediation step that the IT staff opposes. See if you can find a common ground. Now, don't compromise to the point that you've impacted negatively on network security. Your idea of an audit is to improve the organizational security controls, not to damage them. So negotiation only goes so far, but you have to be actually involved and actively interested in compromise for negotiation to work. Conflict resolution often involves some of the exact same steps I've already mentioned, looking at things from the other person's perspective, communicating in such a way as to not inflame any negative emotions, not being accusatory, certainly not talking down to the person or anything of that nature. You are equals, you are colleagues, and you all have the same goal in mind. That's to have a robust security posture for the organization you're auditing. You're all on the same team. You may have different ideas of how to get there. You may have different opinions on the specific deficiencies that need to be addressed and how they need to be addressed, but you do have the same goal. If you keep that in mind and you communicate that through your words, your body language, and your expressions, you're going to go a long way to resolving conflict. When you write up issues, make sure you write them up in a positive light, not an accusatory or negative light. When you're writing your report, you're going to have individual issues that you believe are substandard and need remediation. Think about the use of words. For example, I just used the word substandard. That tends to have a negative connotation. Instead of talking about deficiencies, talk about room for improvement. Talk about ways to make the situation better, not necessarily how bad it is. Now, I do not suggest that you take this to such an extreme that you're glossing over real issues. Real issues need to be clearly and concisely described, but be careful in your language so that you're not using terms that are almost guaranteed to inflame a negative response from the auditee's IT staff. Your report. We have a lot to say on the report. Let's start with the essentials that should be in there. Obviously, the organization you're auditing, who should receive a copy of this audit, and any restrictions. Now, that may sound a little odd, but audits contain a lot of confidential information. We shouldn't be distributing them to just anyone. Are there restrictions on circulation? What was the scope of your audit? Specifically, what was it you audited? And I like to add anything that was expressly excluded. I want to be very clear in my audit that these items were not audited, and here's why. What were the objectives of your audit? This should be numerous. There's not just an objective and not something generic like to test security. You had very specific issues. We wanted to find out if the web server was vulnerable to these specific attacks. We wanted to check to see if the authorization and access control mechanisms were resistant to these specific attacks. We wanted to find out if the database integrity steps met these regulatory requirements. Those are specific objectives. The period of coverage. Oftentimes years, a month, 12 months is a common one, a one-year audit. But you may do a 6-month audit, a quarterly audit, a 2-year audit, whatever. What was the period of coverage? The nature of your audit, the techniques you used, the overall approach, that sort of thing. The timing and extent. When did you do the audit, and how extensive was it? Obviously, your findings, this needs to be quite detailed. Exactly what did you find? How did you find it, and what does it mean? Conclusions. What are your conclusions, and more particularly your recommendations for follow-up? And particularly the conclusions need to be supported by solid evidence. There needs to be a clear reason for these conclusions. It's not enough for it simply to be your opinion. Do you have any reservations or qualifications? For example, you might be saying that a particular security control is adequate as long as a second security control is also kept in place. There are two security controls. In our hypothetical situation, let's say a firewall and an intrusion detection system. In your opinion, the firewall is good enough, it meets standard, provided the intrusion detection system is operating normally, because it can make up for whatever the firewall lacks. Now that's just a hypothetical. If you have any reservations or qualifications to your conclusions or recommendations at all, make sure you clearly state them in your report. Now you can take these findings and conclusions and organize them in a variety of ways. One way to do that is to group them by materiality. In other words, what is this relevant to? How material is this specific conclusion or finding? Or you might group them by intended recipient. You always want to mention the specific faults and constructive corrections, but you want to do it in a non-threatening way. Yes, you have constructive corrections. Yes, there were faults, but you want to phrase it in such a way as to ensure that the IT staff doesn't feel like they're under attack. You must have evidence to support your results, and in many cases, this will be many pages of detailed data, so it's commonplace to put those in a separate appendix. You, of course, have to have your overall findings, conclusion, and opinion. And absolutely, this has to be signed and dated. Make sure you keep in mind, and you go over again and again, appropriate communication techniques. Now, the test will ask you something about these and about reporting, but there's a limit to how much the test can cover in a written test regarding listening and verbal communication skills. If you feel you have any lack in any of these areas, it's worth your time to take a class in appropriate listening, conflict resolution, or business communication. This concludes Knowledge Statement 1.9. CISA Knowledge Statement 1.10. Knowledge of audit quality assurance systems and frameworks. This lesson is the beginning of our discussion of audit quality. We will revisit that issue in subsequent lessons, and it will be met again and again throughout the course. This one will be just an introduction here. Remember that auditing standards are the minimum parameters or minimum requirements to be taken into account of when performing an audit, and keep that term minimum in mind. It's always appropriate to exceed these standards, but audit standards give you a minimum level that you must achieve. It's important for any information systems auditor to understand the impact of the information systems environment on traditional auditing practices and techniques. This is to ensure that audit objectives are achieved. Put another way, there are a number of auditing techniques and practices, some of which have been borrowed from other domains outside of information systems. You need to know your specific information system environment that you're working with and how it might impact your practices and techniques. Control self-assessments. This is going to be a major part of this particular lesson. In this process, the auditor is basically acting as a facilitator, facilitating the business process owners in assisting them in defining and assessing appropriate controls. Now, the IS auditor doesn't actually conduct the control self-assessment. The process owner does. The auditor helps them to take into account the risk appetite of the organization and how that control fits into the overall organizational strategy. This is done because process owners are often in the best place to define appropriate controls because they have an intimate knowledge of that process. Consider controls designed to protect your database. Who understands those needs better than the database administrator? However, the IS auditor can help that process owner, in our scenario a database administrator, understand the needs for controls based on business risk. What is the business appetite for risk? What are other controls in place outside the database domain that might impact it? There are a lot of broader factors the IS auditor can assist with. So the main areas we're going to look at under this knowledge statement are we're going to start looking at audit programs and methodologies. We'll revisit that again in more detail in later lessons. We're going to take a look at audit objectives. We're also going to start our evaluation of audit strengths and weaknesses. The major focus of this lesson is control self-assessments. Now let's stop right there. What does a control self-assessment have to do with quality assurance? Well, let's assume this organization in question does a full audit every year. That may be inadequate. Control self-assessments allow business process owners to evaluate specific controls within their domain of influence and to assure compliance with various standards at any point during the year. They can do it quarterly, monthly, or as needed. That's always going to impact positively the quality of your audit. We're going to look at objectives, advantages, and disadvantages of the control self-assessment. We're going to examine the auditor's role in a CSA, and we'll talk about using the services of other auditors and experts. We'll also look at the traditional versus CSA approach. Now, before we move on, let's discuss using the services of other auditors and experts. This is a relatively brief but important subsection of this knowledge statement. First of all, we might rely on other auditors, particularly if an auditor came in and recently did an audit of a specific system. Let's assume you're doing a general audit of an enterprise, but just last month they had a PCI compliance audit. It's probably not cost effective for you to repeat the same things that were done in the PCI compliance audit, so you might include by reference that audit in your audit report and use the conclusions of that audit to help you conduct your own audit. Now, obviously there's always a concern that you're relying on the product of another auditor. Depending on the scope and the level of reliance, this doesn't need to be too great a concern. Normally you do this when a very specific audit was recently done for a specific purpose, and you're only relying a little bit on that auditor's results. You also may frequently need to rely on experts. Let's assume in the process of your auditing, you have to check compliance on a web server. The web server is a Linux-based server running Apache. You are strictly a Windows person. You know nothing about Linux or Apache other than the names. It's probably inappropriate for you to audit that system without some assistance from someone more knowledgeable in Linux and Apache. This is a frequent thing in audits. You cannot know everything. So from time to time, you're going to have to rely on an expert in a specific technology field. Now let's start looking at CSA. This is a methodology used to review key business objectives. Let's start with that. CSAs are limited. We have a specific business objective in mind. We have risks, only those associated with that specific objective, and only those internal controls designed to mitigate those specific risks. Now the CSA takes that very narrow view and gives us a formal documented process to collaborate on assessing that specific control. Think for a moment about the name. Control self-assessment. We're going to look at a specific control, or at most a grouping of very closely related controls. We're going to assess the efficacy of those controls as compared to some standard, and this is going to be a self-assessment. It's going to be conducted by the process owner that owns those controls. This can be a management technique used to assure stakeholders, customers, and any other relevant party that the internal control systems are reliable. It's helpful in between audits. If you do an annual audit, you may wish to quarterly, monthly, or as needed do a quick CSA. It can also be used to recheck very specific critical processes. Because it's a self-assessment, it ensures employees are aware of business risk and that they're conducting periodic, proactive reviews of controls. The term proactive is critical. We would like these to be done on a periodic basis, not only done in response to an incident. Let's not wait till something negative has occurred that indicates some gap in our controls. Let's proactively evaluate. Let's not even wait for the annual review. If we have a concern, let's conduct a CSA and evaluate the concerned controls now. Now, CSA can involve any number of tools or techniques on a continuum of sophistication. Could be as simple as a questionnaire, could be a facilitated workshop involving tools, techniques, and studies. The simple questionnaire, let me give you an example of that. Perhaps you're doing a control self-assessment on a policy that's meant to control some issue. A simple questionnaire sent to relevant employees can help you ascertain whether or not the policy is being applied or not. In a facilitated workshop, a little more time is required because individuals related to the group of controls or the specific control in question get together. The process is usually facilitated by an IS auditor, but still the process owners work together through this workshop to do a control self-assessment. What are the objectives of a CSA? Well, let's start with leveraging the internal audit function. We should have some level of internal audit functionality even if we periodically and routinely do extensive external audits. With the CSA, we're taking some of that internal audit function and shifting some of the control monitoring responsibilities out to the functional areas. This does two things. It distributes the workload more evenly, but it also gets the line managers who are directly working with the processes and systems in questions directly in charge of monitoring the controls within their sphere of influence. This can also be used to educate management on control design and monitoring. Now, the COBIT standard provides some guidance on the development of a CSA. Let's take a brief look at COBIT. First and foremost, you should know that COBIT was designed and developed by CISA. Given that the CISA exam is also designed and developed by CISA, it should come as no surprise to you to expect a great many COBIT questions on the exam. What we're doing in this particular lesson is introducing you to COBIT. You're going to see much more in-depth details on COBIT as we go throughout this course. COBIT is an acronym for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. CISA first released the standard in 1996. It's been revised several times. In 2005, it became an International Standards Organization standard called ISO 17799-2005. The current version as of this video was published in 2012 and it's COBIT 5. There are 134 detailed information security controls based on 11 areas. Now, you're not going to have to memorize all 134 information security controls, but you will need to have a general understanding of COBIT, and I would suggest beginning by memorizing these specific facts you see on the screen now. First and foremost, you should know that COBIT was designed and developed by CISA. Given that the CISA exam is also designed and developed by CISA, it should come as no surprise to you to expect a great many COBIT questions on the exam. What we're doing in this particular lesson is introducing you to COBIT. You're going to see much more in-depth details on COBIT as we go throughout this course. COBIT is an acronym for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. CISA first released the standard in 1996. It's been revised several times. In 2005, it became an International Standards Organization standard called ISO 17799-2005. The current version as of this video was published in 2012 and it's COBIT 5. There are 134 detailed information security controls based on 11 areas. Now, you're not going to have to memorize all 134 information security controls, but you will need to have a general understanding of COBIT, and I would suggest beginning by memorizing these specific facts you see on the screen now. Now, as an auditor, you might be a little suspicious of the control self-assessment. Isn't an external auditor more objective? Well, usually they are. They're also more experienced at auditing. So what are our advantages of a CSA? Put another way, why do people do them? Early detection of risk may be the most important. Comprehensive audits can be very effective, but due to their resource-intensive nature, they don't happen quickly enough. You're lucky if they happen once a year, sometimes not even that often. A CSA can be conducted much more frequently, providing early detection of risk as opposed to waiting for the next full audit. This will lead to more effective and improved internal controls because the process owners that understand those processes and controls better than almost anyone else are the ones assessing their controls. They're better positioned to give feedback and perhaps recommend changes. This gets employees involved in the auditing process, which creates a more cohesive team. The employees and the auditors are working closely together. The employees now have a sense of ownership of the controls. They are directly auditing or at least assessing their own controls, and they feel more a part of the process. Because in between major audits you're doing CSAs, you're finding and either correcting problems or perhaps establishing and confirming that controls are effective in between the audits. This is going to improve your audit rating process, and it's going to reduce control cost. We don't wait until an incident has occurred, and we don't wait till an extensive audit to identify any control deficiencies. We can do that at any time via CSA. This is also going to cause an increased communication between operations and top management, because the operations personnel conducting the CSA will have to be discussing the results with upper management. This can lead to highly motivated employees. Since they're involved directly in their own control assessment, they have much more of a stake in it. They're much more motivated, much more engaged. This also provides assurance to both customers and other stakeholders that you are routinely checking critical controls. And that's a point we haven't discussed deeply enough yet. How do you pick the target of a CSA? You don't just check any system, because although a CSA is quicker and easier than an actual audit, it still does take some time and resources. The way you select the target for a CSA are those systems or those controls you have the most concern over based on prior risk analysis. There are some disadvantages. Some people may think, well, if we're doing these CSAs, do we really need a full audit? Well, a CSA is not a replacement for audit. Obviously, the people doing the CSA are going to perceive this as additional workload. They may already be taxed to the limit of their capabilities. If the employees take the time to be fully engaged, fully motivated, conduct the self-assessment, come up with improvement suggestions, and they're ignored, that can be damaging to employee morale. They can begin to view their self-assessments as a simple, wasteful exercise and become less engaged, and they'll become less effective. Inadequate motivation will limit the effectiveness and discovery of weak controls. If the people doing the self-assessment are not motivated to do it or not totally engaged, then it will be ineffective. Now remember, in a CSA, the auditor is not conducting the assessment. The process owner is. So what is the auditor's role in CSA? As a control professional and assessment facilitator, basically, the management staff and the process owners are doing the CSA, not the auditor. All you can do is provide expert consulting and to facilitate assessments as needed, answer questions, recommend tools or techniques, that sort of thing. So let's look at the CSA and traditional approach. In a traditional audit approach, tasks are assigned. Now, some of those tasks may be assigned to employees within the organization. Most will be done by the audit staff. In a CSA, the employees themselves are empowered, but they're also accountable for the results. Traditional audits are driven by policy requirements, period. CSAs are a continuous improvement learning curve. You do them whenever it's necessary, you learn and you improve. With a traditional audit, there's very limited employee participation. With the CSA, there's extensive participation and training. That is probably the most obvious difference between a CSA and an audit. In a traditional audit, there's limited stakeholder focus. The stakeholders are simply initiating the audit. In the CSA, there's more broad stakeholder focus. The traditional audit is done by auditors and other specialists. The CSA is conducted by staff at all levels. Anyone who's directly related to the business process or the controls for that business process can be involved in a CSA. This concludes Knowledge Statement 1.10. CISA Knowledge Statement 1.11. Knowledge of various types of audits, internal, external, financial, etc., and methods for assessing and placing reliance on the work of other auditors or control entities. Within the scope of this knowledge statement, we're going to examine the nuanced differences between internal and external audits, when one or the other is appropriate, and the weaknesses and strengths. We're also going to take a look at specific domain audits, a financial audit, a PCI compliance audit, audits that have a very narrow scope. We're also going to look at criteria for relying on the work product of other auditors. Now we've looked at the strengths and weaknesses. When are good times to use an internal audit? First of all is a pre-audit. If you have an external audit that could have severe repercussions if you fail it, such as regulatory compliance audits, legal compliance audits, you might wish to do a pre-audit several weeks in advance so you have an opportunity to identify and correct issues before the formal audit. You may wish to check periodically to ensure that you're in compliance with various regulations, laws, and industry norms. If there's been an incident, such as a cyber breach or virus outbreak, it's often a good idea to do at least a limited post-incident audit. That allows you to identify the extent of the breach or problem or incident, and to look and see if there are other vulnerabilities that could lead to a repetition of that same incident. If you have specific processes or systems that are often targeted, those might require internal audit. What about external audits? What are their strengths and weaknesses? The first obvious strength is they are totally unbiased. Another strength is presumably these are audit professionals. Their primary job function is to conduct audits. They've learned a lot from all of the other audits of other organizations they've conducted, things that your internal team could not possibly know due to their limited exposure. The weaknesses of an external audit are first and foremost cost. It's expensive. It costs a lot to bring in external firms or teams to audit your systems. It's also not as easy to schedule. These audit teams are always conducting audits all over the country or world. You may have difficulty scheduling it exactly when you need. They're often used to absolutely ensure you're in compliance. Many industry standards, many legal requirements require that you have an external audit. So do many regulatory requirements. They insist that the audit be done externally. Also, a general overall audit of your system from an unbiased professional auditor can be an excellent way to check to see if your system is actually in compliance. It's not a case of whether you should use internal or external. You should actually use both. It's a case of when to use one or the other. Specific domain audits. You might have a financial audit. You're looking at those systems directly involved in financial transactions. There are sometimes regulatory audits. If you're in a business that does banking or healthcare, you have specific regulations and you must have audits to see if you're in compliance with those regulations. If you process credit card payments, the payment card industry data security standards require periodic PCI audits. So you have to have an audit, and the sole goal of that audit is to determine whether or not you're in compliance with the PCI data security standards. You might have specific IT audits. For example, you may wish to audit just the web and e-commerce systems, or maybe just the database systems, or just network infrastructure. Any item that requires attention outside of that of a general audit. There are lots of occasions where you might do a specific domain audit. The last category looked at, IT specific, you might do a risk analysis and determine which of your systems is most vulnerable, and periodically do an internal domain-specific audit for that specific system. There are occasions when you need to rely on other auditors' work. It's always a good idea to look at previous audits if their reports exist. That will allow you to see if the items listed for remediation in those audits have since been addressed. It will let you see if there's been a persistent problem that's existed throughout many audit periods. It will allow you to compare and contrast what you find with what past auditors have found. It may be the case that you need to incorporate other audits into your audit report. For example, if 2 months ago there was a PCI audit or an internal database-specific audit, rather than repeat those audit processes and steps, you might wish to incorporate them within your own audit. That's usually more cost-effective. Now, one of the things you want to look out for is ensuring that you're not incorporating or relying on a past audit or other audit that wasn't appropriately done. Any experienced auditor should be able to review an audit report and determine if it was appropriate, complete, and reliable. You do that by looking at the evidence presented. Take a close look not just at the other auditor's conclusions, but the evidence he or she used to base those conclusions. There are several factors to be considered in any audit, whether it's internal or external, domain-specific, it doesn't matter. What is the audit subject? What's the area to be audited? This needs to be quite specific. You can't say, I just want to audit all my systems. What specific things are going to be checked? This will often be a detailed inventory of the systems and processes to be audited. What are your objectives? Now, this is normally not a single objective. It's a list of sub-objectives, and in some cases that can go many levels deep. You might have sub-objectives to sub-objectives to sub-objectives. For example, your goal is to preserve the integrity of financial transactions. That's a high-end, high-level objective. Beneath that, since you do e-commerce, you want to ensure the security of your web server and the integrity of web-based transactions. Beneath that, you want to specifically test to see if your e-commerce site is vulnerable to cross-site scripting. So you can see how we have sub-objectives. Audit scope is also important. What are the constraints to audit the specific system, function, unit, or period of time? In other words, you've been given a scope. That may limit the time period of the audit, what systems you're going to audit, how much you can audit, how disruptive your audit can be. All of these are issues that should be taken into account when conducting any audit. This concludes Knowledge Statement 1.11. We're going to talk about some exam pointers for Domain 1, and we'll talk about these for all the domains. Do keep in mind that I'm not saying that this is all you need to know for this domain. I'm saying these are points that are so key that if you don't know them, you have no chance of passing the test. So I'm going to read some of these. I won't read every single one of them because you can read them yourself, but some bear a little comment. The auditor is a facilitator in a controlled self-assessment. That's listed first because it's an important point to keep in mind, and you'll definitely be asked about it. Controlled self-assessment enhances audit responsibility. In other words, individuals are basically checking their own controls. Now, these are two different points about the controlled self-assessment. You should expect to see quite a few. Number 4 is one of my favorite. If you don't have authentication and identification as part of your access control, you just don't have accountability at all. Responsibility and accountability can be established by use of audit trails. That's point number 8. Very important to keep in mind that the whole point of an audit is checking for responsibility and accountability. Now again, it's not important that I read these to you. You're certainly capable of reading. I am simply pointing out a few key ones that are of most importance. Identifying those high-risk areas should be one of the first things to look at when you're going to start auditing and monitoring, because those are the areas you need to audit. Now, this next few points are all talking about risk, and risk-based auditing is an important part of the CISA, and you should expect to see questions about it. Knowing about risks such as inherent risk, known threats and their impact, things like that are very important for the CISA exam. Detection of risk can be minimized by use of statistical sampling. What we mean is the work you put into detecting risk, not the actual detection. So statistically sampling things allows you to detect risk without having to look at each and everything. These are just a few pointers. Really make sure you know all of the major concepts of Domain 1. Now you've completed Domain 1. Let's summarize what we covered. In Domain 1, we outlined the framework for performing an IS audit. We look specifically at mandatory requirements, what an IS auditor's mission is, what they actually do, what the best practices are to have an effective IS audit, and the basic process of auditing. This is a fundamental lesson that gets you comfortable with the basic process of auditing. This will form the basis and the foundation for the additional lessons we'll cover in the other 4 domains. This concludes Domain 1.